Trapped and hungry in Libya, as opposing armies battle for control of Tripoli, thousands of African refugees are in detention centres. How did they end up there? And as food and water runs out, who's looking after them? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Imran Khan. They enter Libya illegally from all over Africa, hoping it's a stepping stone to starting a new life in Europe. But many are caught on this dangerous and stressful journey. They're sent to detention centres in the suburbs of Tripoli and other cities. But the UN-recognised government in the capital, in charge of the refugees, is fighting for its life, trying to stop a takeover by warlord Khalifa Haftar. So the refugees are trapped in detention centres where conditions are worsening. Most of the centres are in the suburbs of Tripoli and house thousands. Some of the centres became the front line of the war to seize Tripoli. At least 2 migrants were killed last month when Haftar's forces attacked the southern districts of the capital. The UN moved hundreds of refugees to safety. With government leaders in Tripoli focused on controlling the capital, some refugees aren't receiving the basics they need to survive. Al Jazeera has been told food and water supplies are running low at one centre, with some refugees going days without anything to eat. Let's bring in our panel. In Geneva, we have Charlie Yaxley. He's a spokesman for the UN Refugee Agency. In Istanbul, we have Saleh El-Bakoush. He's a Libyan political analyst who was kidnapped in 2017 by a Libyan gang and ended up in a government-run detention facility. And in Brussels, we Alberto Neidhart. He's a policy analyst at the European Policy Centre who researches migration issues. Welcome to you all. I'd like to begin with Saleh El-Bakoush in Istanbul. It must have been a very harrowing experience being in one of those government-run detention centres. Can you just give us a sense of what it was like?
Well, it was certainly horrible, being kidnapped past midnight and taken by an armed gang to a facility that also housed some immigrants. It was outside the government control at that time, I suppose, until we managed to escape, myself and 2 other prisoners.
So the conditions in the camp, can you just give us an idea of what they were like then?
I never got a view of the camp, only of the room we were. It was a room with no windows. The walls were covered with mold and dirt. There were no facilities. The room was our bedroom, our dining room, and our bathroom as well, until we escaped.
Charlie Yaxley, in Geneva, you work for the UN Refugee Agency. Conditions must have got worse since 2017 when Saleh El-Bakoush was in that government detention facilities. What are they like now?
Well, even before the recent clashes, for some months, UNHCR were calling for no refugees and migrants rescued at sea to be returned to these centres. And part of the reason for that was because when violence flares up in Tripoli, what we've seen is that at times detention centres can be left unguarded with refugees locked inside, insufficient provisions of food and water, and in general there's been widespread reports of human rights violations occurring inside these detention centres. And the situation is particularly bad for those in the unofficial detention centres, many of which are run by traffickers and smugglers. And what we see there is that people then are at very high risk of being tortured or even finding themselves sold into slavery. So there are really dire conditions here. Nobody should be returned to anywhere in Libya at this time.
Can you just give us an idea, Charlie, about the idea of the numbers we're talking about? What kind of numbers of people are there?
Well, in recent weeks, we've been desperately trying to evacuate people out of detention centres, particularly those that are close to the hostilities. We've been able to do that to some extent with some degree of success, but they've been moved from one detention centre to another detention centre where there are risks that remain, particularly if the hostilities spread. Right now we have around 3,000 refugees and migrants who remain in detention centres inside Tripoli. And we're really in a race against time. We're urging the international community to come forward with humanitarian corridors, resettlement places, whatever it takes to get people out of this situation.
Alberta Neidhart in Brussels, you've researched migration at length. Can you just tell us what are the driving factors that make people risk winding up in one of these government detention centres in the outskirts of Tripoli?
Absolutely. This is a crucial element that oftentimes it's not analyzed in the discussion because the focus is on so-called pull factors to Europe. But what the situation in Libya now shows is that the persons who try to reach Europe, who are willing to put their lives in danger, do not try to reach Europe because of the social benefits or the housing policies of the member states of the European Union, but because they are trying to escape a situation where they are subject to abuse, torture, where they face war or even death.
Saleh, in Istanbul, it's a very lucrative business for the militias and the criminal gangs that often cooperate with each other. Is there a connection between the militias in Libya and criminal gangs, and are they cooperating with each other?
Well, from previous experiences around the world, you know that whenever there is a problem like the refugees, there will be militias and criminal gangs that try to make some money out of it. And it's no different in Libya. The government of national accord faces a lot of problem. Some of it is because of lack of international support. Some of it is because of the Europeans and their conflicts around the immigration policy, and some of it is due to internal politics and the support, for example, of the Emiratis and the Egyptians and the Saudis, of General Haftar, who refuses to recognize the government of national accord and attacks it in every which way he can, the latest of which is an attack on the capital, which makes the national government unable to fulfill its obligations towards these immigrants and towards its own citizens.
Charlie, in Geneva, there is a war going on in Libya for the capital, Tripoli. That must make your job incredibly difficult to try, and the UN Refugee Agency's job incredibly difficult to try and get people out. What are the real problems you're facing when it comes to the battle?
I mean, in the last few weeks alone, we've had around 45,000 people inside Tripoli become displaced. Many of them have gone to stay with families outside the city, but there are many others who are being forced to take shelter inside the city. They're using schools and other community infrastructure as makeshift displacement sites. But these are really wholly unsuitable to provide for the humanitarian needs that people have. I mean, humanitarian organizations are doing our best to provide food, clean water, healthcare, and other relief items. But it's extremely challenging. We have to make the most of pauses in fighting to rush aid to people as soon as we can. At the same time, our teams are risking significant dangers in order to help people to get on planes, to get them out of the detention centres in order to take part in these evacuation programmes. Some of them we're taking to our gathering and departure facility, but that's approaching its maximum capacity and will soon be full. So really we're in a race against time to get people the assistance they need, but really, more than anything, we need to find a way to get people out as soon as possible.
Alberta Neidhart, it's a race against time, says Charlie Yaxley in Geneva. There is a security issue here for the European Union, isn't there? There's a real problem that the European Union faces when it comes to dealing with this. What could they be doing and what more should they be doing to try and solve this crisis?
As it has been mentioned, there is the possibility of setting up humanitarian corridors, and we have seen in the past few days that some European states have established channels for detained migrants to reach Europe, but so far these measures have been ad hoc decisions. What we need is, of course, a more structured and more concerted approach to the situation in Libya. What we also need is, of course, for those who in the future weeks and months will attempt to reach Europe by crossing the Mediterranean Sea, is the possibility for intervention by European ships in search and rescue operations. At the moment, there are no European ships patrolling the Mediterranean Sea, which means that should there be an emergency, the people who try to reach Europe will be risking their lives, and at the same time, due to the situation, political situation, and to the armed conflict in Libya, the Libyan Coast Guard is currently also not patrolling the Mediterranean Sea. So absolutely, I agree with Charlie that we need, of course, to set up humanitarian corridors, and the European Union should do more to solve a situation which is currently getting worse and worse as we speak.
Saleh Al-Bakush in Istanbul. There is a geopolitical element to all of this. You mentioned Saudi Arabia, the UAE, as being key players in backing Khalifa Haftar and his attack on Tripoli. And then you have the UN-backed government in Tripoli itself fighting effectively for its life. Why would the European Union, the UN, place pressure on the Saudis and the UAE to stop their backing for Khalifa Haftar? Why do we have all of these players creating a situation that's leading to this refugee crisis?
Well, first of all, to go back to your guest's comment about finding a way to establish humanitarian corridors and so on. I mean, before the current conflict, we were faced with a lack of a unified European policy on immigration. Now, that's matched by a lack of a European policy on how to deal with Libya politically. You see the conflict between the Italians and the French and the rest of Europe and so on. Of course, this lack of policy has continued since Mr. Macron initiated the current round of appeasement to Haftar by inviting him to Paris and giving him the status of a statesman and so on. And now Mr. Macron is busy with the yellow vests, and he wants a simple policy that's offered by his foreign minister, Mr. Le Drian, which is support a new dictator and get it over with. So we have all these conflicts between the rest of the world and Europe, and within Europe itself, and also because of the Emiratis and Saudis and their preference with the Egyptians to oppose the Arab Spring, to oppose democracy in the area. They see it as a danger and as a threat to their systems. And that's why we have this conflict now and lack of coordination between all the players in the area.
Now, Charlie, partly your job, the UN Refugee Agency's job, is to deal with the situation as it is on the ground. However, the root causes of this, what's actually driving all of this, are, as our guest in Istanbul just said, to do with the European Union, to do with America, to do with the UAE and Saudi Arabia and their backing of various different factions. In your conversations at the UN, how much of that is a frustration?
Well, I mean, absolutely. Any approach to what's happening in Libya needs a holistic and comprehensive outlook that not only looks at the outcomes in terms of people attempting to cross the Mediterranean and now the very pressing needs to get people out of detention centres, but we also need to look at what's happening in countries of origin and in countries of transit, so that we look at the whole journey before people even get to Libya. In countries of origin, more effort needs to be taken to address the root causes that are creating violence and war. We need to increase mediation efforts to bring warring parties to the table in dialogue to end conflict where it exists. And there also needs to be more support to countries throughout sub-Saharan Africa and North Africa with their asylum systems and with development support so that they're better able to accommodate asylum seekers and refugees when they arrive in their countries. But to
Charlie,
come back to an earlier point as well, it's really important that more is done to tackle the criminal networks and the smuggling networks that thrive off people's despair in these situations. They need to be held to account and they need to be held accountable in a court of law and their operations ceased if we're going to see a change here.
Absolutely. That's bringing Alberta Neidhart in Brussels. It's a very interesting point that Charlie Yaxley makes in Geneva when he talks about there needs to be more done about the criminal gangs. Now, what's the European Union's policy towards investigating these gangs and these networks?
So currently, the major operation in place by the European Union, which is Operation Sophia, is directed at dismantling smugglers' network. What has to be said, however, is that, as we have heard, smugglers' network are oftentimes tightly connected with official authorities. So at the moment, it is really hard to draw a line, and I absolutely agree that smugglers must be tried and they must be held accountable for their actions. But it is also true that the ambiguity when it comes to the European Union's policy towards Libya is that oftentimes what are funded are not Libyan Coast Guard authorities, but smugglers themselves. So it is really hard to unravel the complex Libyan situation and draw a clear line at the moment.
Saleh, in Istanbul, it is a very complex situation within Libya itself. But the bottom line seems to be that a lot of people in Libya are making a lot of money from these smuggling routes, these people trafficking, human trafficking routes. How difficult then is it to dismantle those networks? Why isn't the UN-backed government been able to dismantle those networks?
Well, you dismantle them by making sure that the root causes of this problem are solved. The root causes are in the countries of origin. Libya is just at a transit point. For example, and I agree with your guest from Brussels, that when we talk about dismantling this criminal network, I agree with that if you include in it also the regimes that are controlling those countries. For example, I give you an example. The reports are known about Agadez in Niger, and it's a city. Its annual income from this business is 100 million a year in a country where the average wage is about the average income is about $30 a month per individual. This is a city where a lot of these migrants stay for a couple of days or a few days before they move on to Libya. And they move on to Libya with the protection of government soldiers. I mean, but these regimes are supported and mostly by France. France is supporting a dictator that's been in power for over 20 years in Chad, a dictator that's been in power for 33 years in Niger, and so on. So unless you solve that problem, I mean, the problem in Libya cannot be addressed with the continuing journeys of refugees year-round from these countries of origin.
So there's an incredible amount of frustration in your voice. You seem to be very angry about this. Do you think both the European Union, the wider world generally, is taking the wrong approach to sorting out this migrant problem, this refugee problem?
They don't want the refugees. They support dictatorships in Africa. They don't want to do any development in Africa. And then they complain and they fight among each other. How could these countries that are poor in terms of resources, in terms of governance, can solve this issue. Libyans are 6 million people with a lot of oil. They don't need the migrant business to prosper. But since the government is not doing anything because of European interference, Emirati interference, the war is going on, so these criminal gangs flourish and do other business other than the business that's available in a country that's stable with a lot of oil resources.
Charlie Yaxley in Geneva, do you think anybody's listening to the kind of opinion our guest in Istanbul is saying?
Well, we have seen some progress in certain areas. There are some seeds of hope for this. I mean, we have seen a handful of European countries who have come together, and although it's on an ad hoc basis, it has happened now on a number of occasions where they've come forward to allow boats carrying people leaving Libya to disembark and to share a distribution of the people on board. We've also seen other countries who have taken part in the evacuation and resettlement processes. But, this is just a drop in the ocean right now for what's needed. And we don't have the luxury of time to wait for these to become more fleshed out. We need a Europe-wide approach that comes forward, rooted in those principles of compassion and humanity and respect for human rights that the European Union was founded on, to come forward with a fair and just and equitable approach to this.
Alberta Neidhart in Brussels, Europe needs to step up. This is what we seem to be hearing from both of our guests in Istanbul and in Geneva. They need to do more, but they're not doing more. What's the problem?
At the moment, there are several problems that probably have been for far too long set aside. One, of course, as it has been mentioned, is the European Union has now been able to develop a coherent foreign policy. But when it comes to the specific needs of both migrants who are currently held in detention centers or those who transit across Libya, I think the problem has been that there was no specific effort or success that addresses the problem of legal pathways to reach Europe. Currently, a person who wants to reach the European Union to file an application for asylum doesn't have the possibility of reaching the European Union safely or regularly. So there we have a serious fault by the European Union that over and over again has not been able to reach a consensus over legal pathway. And another problem, of course, is that ever since 2015, that is the onset of the so-called migration crisis, many decisions have been taken, but the overall goal has been to decrease the number of arrivals rather than finding a solution, as has been mentioned, rooted in the principles of protection of human rights and with the goal in mind of respecting and fulfilling the obligation of member states under the Geneva Convention. So there we have a lack of long-term and short-term on the part of the European Union. Member states have not been able to reach a consensus, and really, as it has been mentioned, the current crisis in Libya only makes these decisions more urgent.
I would like to thank all our guests. Sadly, we are out of time. Charlie Yaxley, Saleh Al-Bakoush and Alberta Neidhart, thank you very much. And thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And you can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Imran Khan, and the whole team here, bye for now.